Good morning, everyone, or I suppose it's not necessarily morning for you, but today, week 12, our lecture is over purpose in literature and thesis statements in academic essays. So we're talking about purpose and thesis statements because it's an important skill in writing formal college-level papers. It also allows us to apply critical thinking and analytical skills to short fiction and academic articles so that we can discuss and write about them effectively. And it helps us construct nuanced papers about literature and other things using resources from a variety of sources. So, previously in the semester, we talked about authors' purposes in different pieces of literature. Remember, we did some writing about this as well. You practiced some analysis, and an important part in analyzing is being able to identify the author's purpose, because that's how we connect everything together. Creative pieces like short stories, plays, anything like that, essays, creative nonfiction, science fiction, anything like that, all have a guiding purpose that's clear to the readers. And this is an important thing because, as we discussed previously, different readers will find different purposes in pieces of literature. An author usually writes with one of the four general purposes in mind. So to relate a story or recount events, an author may use narrative writing. So these are things that we see in creative nonfiction like memoirs, sometimes autobiographies, things like that. The second purpose an author may have is to tell what something looks like, sounds like, or feels like, and we use descriptive writing to do that. So we can have descriptive writing in any kind of writing, really, as long as we're trying to explain what things sound and feel like. So we're using those creative elements, figurative language like we talked about previously in the semester. A third purpose could be to convince a reader to believe an idea or take a course of action. And that, of course, is persuasive writing, which we've had some practice at in the past. The fourth purpose is to inform or teach the reader using expository writing. So expository writing is when we're trying to educate someone about information. So if we're writing an informational piece about the history of something, or we're writing some instructions, all of that would be expository writing. We know that authors will use repetition, figurative language, narration, dialogue, and so much more to ensure that readers understand the purpose of the piece. If it's hard for readers to understand the purpose of the piece, then they're not going to continue reading, or they'll finish reading and they'll be like, what the heck did I just read? That was a waste of time. So it's really important as authors writing creative pieces, we have a clear purpose in mind and that purpose remains consistent throughout the piece so that readers don't get confused and have a clear sense of understanding of what we're trying to convey. In a traditional academic essay, the purpose of a piece is reflected in the thesis statement. So, what is a thesis statement? Let's watch a quick little video here.
You should probably read all your poems out loud. Dogs are very good to read poetry too. How to write a killer thesis statement, a la Schmuck. First of all, what do we mean by a killer thesis statement? Could this thing be armed and dangerous? Well, kinda. No, we don't want to see your thesis statement show up on the evening news. But your thesis statement should aim to kill with eloquence, suspense, intrigue, originality, and clarity. Here's an example. Humans are not genetically required to be meat eaters, so vegetarianism is the only moral choice to avoid the senseless killing of animals. It states a valid point, expresses a strong opinion, and can be supported with facts. Doesn't mean it's necessarily true, but it can definitely be debated. A thesis statement is that thing at the very beginning of your paper that tells your reader what this whole thing is going to be about. Right out of the gate, it tells your reader roughly what elements you will develop in the coming paragraphs and exactly how you feel about it. The thesis is the most important part of your essay. It's the heart, soul, and brain of your paper. Once you've got that puppy figured out, you're at least halfway home. How do you get to this promised land? Well, first you got to establish an issue or problem. Think humankind's negative effects on rainforests, the factors that enable politicians to become corrupt, the slow death of the film industry, anything ripe for the picking, and preferably something that is not without a little controversy. The thesis shouldn't be something like, the sun makes it hot outside, because you're not going to hear much argument from anyone on that point. Instead, it should be something interesting, something that perhaps your reader hasn't previously considered. Don't hold back, go right for the gut. To make sure you've got an interesting topic, ask yourself questions someone else might ask you. Play devil's advocate with yourself until you're certain you've covered all the bases. Is it something only you would find interesting, like how affectionate your dog is right after you finish walking him? Or would it appeal to a wide range of readers, like, anything having to do with primetime television, or what's their name, the Kardashians? Is it something that can be argued empirically, like the rise and fall of the stock market? Or is it pretty much just going to be pure opinion, like what the best color is? Keep in mind that you're not just laying down the facts, you also want to get your message across. So be sure to express your thoughts on the issue. Take a strong position. It's not enough to stay racist. For the last 20 years, America has actually become more racist than it was in the 1990s. If your position is that, maybe, I don't know, could be, who cares? It's an intriguing proposition, but it's not going to go anywhere if you plan on being wishy-washy. Either argue strongly for or against the idea. It's the only way you're going to bring your reader to their knees. So, what's a good thesis and what's a bad one? Okay, here we go. Good thesis. World travel is an essential element in any young person's well-rounded education. Bad thesis. There are some great places to visit in Europe, dude. Good thesis. More than anything else in our society, video games are responsible for the dumbing of America. Bad thesis. People are dumb. Good thesis. When an elderly person is deciding on a pet, adopting a cat is a far better option than adopting a dog. Bad thesis. Cats rule. Dogs rule. Get the idea? It should be broad enough that a large portion of your audience will be able to relate, but specific enough that you can zero in on a particular topic and really dissect it. Finally, you can't just state your thesis, drop the mic, and walk off stage. You'll need to bring some supporting points to the table. So be prepared to back your thesis up with some actual factual pieces of evidence. And while quality is certainly more valuable than quantity, have at least 3 supporting points. Any less, and your thesis is going to be a bit flimsy. Put all this together, and you should have a killer thesis statement. If you're absolutely stumped and can't come up with one on your own, you can borrow ours. It gets out on parole in about 3 months.
Okay, so we watched a quick little video about what thesis statements are. Now let's talk a little bit more about those elements in a little bit more depth. So we know that thesis statement is a short statement, usually one sentence, that summarizes the main point or claim of an essay or a research paper or another piece of academic writing. It's developed, supported, and explained in the text by means of examples and evidence. This is a very important piece of your essay because it ensures your point of view is clear and it helps your readers understand how all of the pieces of your essay fit together. Without a thesis statement, it's really hard for your readers to understand why you're telling them the information that you're telling them. So ensuring that you have a clear, concise, and focused thesis statement right up front helps to ensure that your readers will know why you're telling them what you're telling them and what they can expect from reading your work. Authors make connections to their thesis statement in each essay in order to ensure readers understand how each part of the essay relates to the overall argument. So in each paragraph, that should say, sorry, that's a typo, authors make connections to the thesis statement to ensure that readers understand how everything fits together. So if you want to think of writing an essay kind of like putting a puzzle together, you wouldn't necessarily start a puzzle just by trying to figure out where the middle piece is, right? Most of us would probably start by trying to put the edge pieces together and then build our way inward from that. So the thesis statement is kind of like that frame, the structure that provides the organization for your essay. Without a thesis statement, it's really hard for all of the pieces to fit together because your readers don't really understand how the pieces connect to each other. So the elements of strong thesis statements, we know they should be specific, precise, they should be able to be argued, they should be able to be demonstrated, they should be forceful, confident, and original. So specificity, and precision are probably two of the most important parts of writing a thesis statement. It's really easy to write broad, sweeping statements that don't really provide enough information for readers, and we want to be as specific as we possibly can in order to ensure that readers understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. The more vague we are, the more room for interpretation there is for readers, which is confusing and doesn't help us communicate our ideas very clearly. So, these are some examples of thesis statements that need some improvement. So you might want to pause the video here and take a minute to write down some ideas about what could be improved about these thesis statements. We've got the first one here. My paper will explain why studying literature is stupid. Second, literature impacts people. Literature is important. So take a minute here, write down some ideas, pause the video. All right, what did you come up with? I bet some of the things that you came up with are that these thesis statements are vague, they're not very specific, some of them are not really debatable, some of them are highly opinionated, which will make it difficult for them to be proven using research. Let's talk a little bit about them. So these thesis statements are not specific. They're very vague. They don't talk about particular elements that will be discussed or why. My paper will explain why studying literature is stupid. Okay, what kind of literature? What do you mean by stupid? Literature impacts people. Okay, what kind of literature? What kind of people? What kinds of impacts? Literature is important. What kind of literature? Why is it important? So we can see here we need to have some improvement in terms of specificity. Precision. The language isn't precise. What does stupid mean? What does literature mean? What does important mean? All of these things are not very precise. The ability to be argued. They may be able to be argued, but not with research because several of them are highly opinion-based. My paper will explain why studying literature is stupid. That is a valid point of view if that's your opinion. However, it's going to be hard for you to back that up with actual research because you're just trying to explain your opinion to us. The ability to be demonstrated, again, may be able to be demonstrated. You might be able to make the argument, but not with research because they're very opinion-based. And then the final three, forceful, confident, and original. All three of these categories should be worked on by being more thoughtful and confident about what's being written about. The idea that literature impacts people, that's not a very original idea. You could certainly tweak that thesis statement to make it more original. However, that's not done here. All right, so what does a strong thesis statement look like? We saw a couple of strong thesis statements in the video. I wanted to give you some more thesis statements related to literature because that's what we've been talking about and that's what we've been working on this semester. And you may be continuing to work on the projects that you started before spring break, before the pandemic, before everything kind of blew up in our faces. So I've got an example here. Number 1, Shakespeare's use of dramatic irony in Romeo and Juliet spoils the outcome for the audience and weakens the plot. That is very specific. We know that we're talking about Shakespeare's use of dramatic irony in Romeo and Juliet and the impacts it has on the audience and the plot. We know exactly what that person is going to talk about. We know that they're going to talk about Romeo and Juliet. We expect to see information about how it spoils the outcome for the audience and how it weakens the plot. We, as readers, have a very good idea of what to expect from this essay. Number 2, reading literature is critical for children because it helps them develop empathy through new, imagined experiences. Okay, we're going to be talking about reading literature, how it's critical for children, how it causes them to develop empathy, and how it develops their empathy. I think this thesis statement is a strong starting point. I think it could be even better, though. We could talk about what kinds of literature, and how does it make them develop empathy? What does empathy mean in this case? What do we mean by new imagined experiences? So this is a really strong starting point for a rough draft or for a draft of a thesis statement. However, I think as we started working on this essay, we could come back to our thesis statement and make it even more specific. Number 3. Reading literature about the theme of mental health will help English 102 students to be more aware of themselves and others, which is critical to developing as a person. Okay, so we've got a specific, we're talking about mental health in English 102, why it's important. It helps students develop awareness and helps them to develop as a person. Again, I think that this is a really strong starting point. I think as we worked on this essay, we could make our thesis statement even more clear. So we could talk about what it means to be more aware of themselves and others. Also, I think a little bit of information about why it's critical to developing as a person could really help us fully understand this person's argument. However, it's a really, really great starting point. So if you're writing an academic type of essay, you want to be sure that you have a thesis statement. If you're writing a creative piece, fiction, play, anything like that, be sure that your purpose is clear and consistent. In your weekly check-in this week, consider using one of these strategies. You don't have to, these are just some ideas to engage with the material that we talked about today. Consider revisiting an old essay and improving your thesis statement using the guidelines in today's lecture. You could then email me that thesis statement and talk about how you improved it. Consider writing a draft of a thesis statement for the writing project you're working on to get feedback from me. You could submit your thesis statement in the weekly check-in spot on Moodle, and I would give you some feedback about it. And then perhaps you could write or talk a bit about the purpose you identified in the optional reading this week. So this week we read Gabriel Garcia Marquez's A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, and I'm very interested to see what you think the purpose of that creative piece of work is. So if you did have a chance to read that, you could talk a little bit about that in your weekly check-in. And these would be ways for you to engage with today's material, engage with the concept of thesis statements and purpose, which eventually you'll be reflecting on in your reflection towards the end of the semester. If you want to learn more about thesis statements, I've included a couple of links here, and you will have access to this lecture on Moodle. There's a couple of different examples of thesis statements and some activities that you can work on that may help you write your thesis statement a little bit more effectively. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, confusions, anything like that, please let me know.